and thank you.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much for the introduction, Katie. I would normally give a territorial acknowledgement, but you're all in various territories around places. I'm not sure where you all are, so I'll just acknowledge that we are very likely all on unceded First Nations territory, various First Nations people, and we're grateful for letting them sit in our houses and stay safe during the COVID crisis and talk about the ongoing research of the BC Humanists. So yeah, as Katie mentioned, I'm the research coordinator for the BC Humanists, and we are currently working on a raft of different research projects, and there's no possible way we can talk about all of them today. But my plan was to give you an overview of, generally speaking, the current research we're doing around prayer, and specifically legislative prayer. And then we can take sort of deeper dives if anyone's interested in some of the various topics. But we'll look at that. But a couple of the other things we are doing that we won't have time to talk about today are some ongoing research into various tax exemptions given to different religious organizations and places of worship. So one of our next reports that's going to come out looks at permissive tax exemptions for municipalities. And then we've also looked at tax exemptions at the federal level through the CRA, and also other legal exemptions that might be granted for various religious reasons. Those are ongoing, but we don't have time to talk about all of them today. So the plan was generally to talk about our research looking at prayer. And like I mentioned, please ask questions during. It helps me talk about what you guys are interested in. And also we can take questions between sort of the various segments. And I'm going to try and talk about it project by project. And with that in mind, the general basis for a lot of the conversation around legislative prayer, and that's a prayer that takes place in a legislative body, whether that's a municipal council or parliament or a provincial legislature. A lot of that work and a lot of the strength of a lot of the case that we're presenting comes from a 2015 court case from the Supreme Court of Canada. And this is the Saguenay decision. And basically the Saguenay decision, the summary of it, the basic rundown of Saguenay was that you have a gentleman from Saguenay, Quebec, who was attending regular sessions of the municipal council, and they were starting each session of the municipal council with a prayer, an overtly Christian prayer that people were crossing themselves. There was a large cross on the wall, and Alain Simoneau objected to this as being exclusionary, and this went to the Supreme Court, and in 2015, he won this case. And this was really an important legal case because it establishes the constitutional basis for saying that legislative prayer is not okay. And we've done a lot of work building on this in BC, looking at lots of different levels because it is such an important document, such an important decision. And the decision basically states that the state has a duty of religious neutrality, which means that the Canadian government cannot pick sides in religious disputes. It cannot favor one religion over others or no religion. And not only is this, and it described this as being incredibly important. In fact, it was described as a democratic imperative, that a democratic state must have a government that is neutral with respect to religion. And so with this in mind, we have launched a number of research projects looking into legislative prayer, building on the 2015 decision. So the next report that you're likely to see, although temporally speaking, this might vary because we have lots of different reports coming out, but one of our future reports looks at prayer at municipal councils. So we actually have Renil present, which is great because Renil is one of our summer researchers working on this project. Basically, after 2015, no municipal council in Canada can start a meeting, whether it's an inaugural meeting or a random committee session, with a prayer. And we wanted to look into see whether this was the case. And we knew that we had a few complaints from across the province that indicated that not all municipalities were following this after 2015. I noticed my municipality, for example, here in Saanich, started its inaugural session in 2018 with 2 prayers. So we launched this project where we were able to look and to verify which municipalities in BC were following the law that says you cannot start a municipal council meeting with a prayer, and which ones were not. We kind of broke into 2 different categories. We recognize that inaugural meetings, so that's the first meeting that takes place right after new people are elected, right after an election, were treated often slightly differently than regular sessions. And we first started by emailing all the municipal councils and municipalities and asked them if they followed this practice. And we only got responses back from a very small number, and they tended to be the ones that were following the law because no one's going to rat themselves out. Let's go figure. So then we realized that wasn't going to work. And so we had our researchers look at the minutes and video sessions and agendas of every single municipality in British Columbia to verify whether they were following the law post-2015. And we broke this into the inaugural and regular sessions. People will often include a prayer in an inaugural meeting because prayer is often considered as having, and I'm using air quotes here, a solemnizing effect on meetings. This, of course, is not the case, because obviously the Supreme Court has ruled that excluding people from a meeting is not acceptable. And so clearly excluding people from a meeting doesn't really solemnize that meeting. It actually probably undermines the whole purpose of that meeting. But we looked at both of those factors. Oh,
one quick question from Adam.
Really good question. So when it comes to municipal councils, the answer is it varies incredibly. Some municipalities, we couldn't find the minutes. Some of them, we couldn't find the agendas. Some of the websites were down. Some of them have audio video recordings. Typically what happens, though, is that often they will introduce the individual delivering the prayer, and that will be included in the minutes, and the content of the prayer will not be included in the minutes. And this is something we saw reflected at the provincial legislature as well, which I'll talk about momentarily. But yeah, basically it varies considerably, and we ended up having to transcribe a lot of those prayers. Most municipalities don't transcribe their meetings verbatim. They usually rely on audio recordings and sort of jot notes, and so they wouldn't record the content of the prayers. But they will often record, because it's an inaugural meeting, they will record the person delivering the prayer, which actually makes our lives really easy, because if it's, Monsignor Bob delivering the prayer, we can know that it's probably a Christian prayer. And if it was, Imam Bob delivering a prayer, we could probably guess that it was a Muslim prayer. It makes it, from a methodological perspective, a lot easier than trying to guess what religion the prayer belongs to. It seems that, well, I'll get into the results in a second, because maybe differentiating the prayer is quite easy. But yeah, really good question. Any follow-up questions on that? And one reason, actually, just as a bit of an aside, but one reason that a lot of legislative assemblies won't record the content of prayers, and in fact, some will exclude the public from those prayers, it goes back to the British tradition. Prayer in the British legislature was adopted in the 1600s, and it was often considered as a private affair. It was a prayer delivered for the members of the Legislative Assembly. As such, they would exclude members of the public. And so often, the modern translation of this is that the prayers aren't transcribed, and it just says prayers in the minutes, and then they move on. This is often, it's bad from someone who's perspective of someone who's trying to research it. It's good from someone who's trying to not, encourage our Hansard people to waste their time typing up prayers. So it's a bit of a cost-benefit analysis there. But yeah, so our summer researchers looked at the minutes of meetings. We had them do a random selection of post-2015 minutes. We had them look at the inaugural meetings. That was November 2018. Most councils met at that point. And then we also had them pick a couple of random committee meetings just to check to see if those municipalities had a prayer being delivered. And just one point to draw a distinction here. We did draw a distinction between First Nations territorial land acknowledgements and prayers. And recognizing this gets murky sometimes, because sometimes the First Nations territorial land acknowledgement will include deeply religious content, and not necessarily religious content from an Indigenous religion, but often Christian religion. But we left those aside as treating them as a separate category of things. And that's another research project for another day, and I'll also talk a bit more about that momentarily. But yeah, so there are 162 municipalities in British Columbia. I think it's down to 161 because a resort town has lost its classification. Of those, we found that 23 started with prayers. And of those prayers, all 23 of them were Christian prayers. And they were all delivered by Christian members of the clergy who were disproportionately men. And so you kind of see a general trend here. And the scale of the municipalities varied considerably. So 100 Mile House and Lake Cowichan started with prayers. Similarly, Saanich, Victoria, North Vancouver, and Langley all started with prayers. So we're seeing a kind of a wide range. And sort of to wrap up this element of our project, what we've then done is we sent letters to these municipalities to remind them that the Constitution forbids them from starting meetings with a prayer. And we're going to follow up after the next election, which will be in 2020, to see if the municipalities that previously started with prayers have stopped doing so. We suspect that a lot of the municipalities just really weren't aware of Saguenay. It was in 2015, and it's not necessarily the role of whoever's organizing the inaugural meeting to be completely aware of all the laws. So we're going to send them reminders before the next inaugural and follow up on municipalities that continue to break the law in spite of that warning. Yeah, and the second part of this project, which is sort of expanding it, is looking at all 3,700 municipalities across Canada. Yeah, the question was, out of curiosity, was New Westminster one? I don't know if they used it in their inaugural meetings, but I wasn't sure if they've changed. This is a good question. Let me bring up my list. It's sitting right here. So New Westminster was not on that list. No, so it seems like they've updated their practices from last time. However, if you are aware of them starting a meeting with a prayer, because it may have slipped through our net, please let us know, because we're happy to follow up on that. Yeah, the other question here is there any initiative to engage with candidates for municipal elections to get commitments to compliance? That's not something we've thought of, mostly because we don't need their commitment. It's the law. They have to follow it. And so when you have a big stick like the Canadian Constitution, you don't need to ask people to follow it. They are required to by law. So the severity and the strength of the wording of letters that will be sent to municipalities was very generous when we first let them know, and before 2015, before the last inaugural in 2018. But if those 23 municipalities continue to practice after 2020, they would have had fair warning. And at this point, we don't really need a commitment from them. We need them to change that behavior immediately. And it's a legal issue at that point. The next question was, were there any municipalities that had a rotating religious or otherwise opening? The answer is we don't know, because we only looked at the inaugural meetings at 2018. We did ask municipalities and look to see if municipalities have previously changed their practices. One of the challenges you get is the inaugural meetings are often orchestrated by the current incoming or incumbent mayor. And as a result, it tends to be kind of different every year depending on who the mayor is. And there doesn't tend to be lots of practices that are passed on from year to year. So basically the mayor comes in, they invite their favorite priest to come give a prayer, they pick their favorite bagpiper, their favorite judge comes in to help them with the oath of office, and friends and family are invited and that kind of thing. So there isn't really a lot of concrete procedures that are around those kinds of things. But that's a really good question. The provincial legislature of Ontario starts with the Lord's Prayer and a rotation of a number of other prayers, which include Baha'i, Jewish, Muslim, and First Nations, and I think one other one I've forgotten, potentially a Sikh prayer. And they have a rotation where they append those on after the Lord's Prayer. But we haven't noticed any municipalities with a kind of rota of religions, as you will. If you're interested in that, though, the legislature of Scotland does have a process whereby they start with prayer, but the person delivering the prayer, they're directly proportionate with the most recent census. If 25% of people in Scotland are Anglican, then 25% of the prayers opening their legislature will be Anglican. And they've asked some really cool invocations. They had a woman deliver one to be at British Sign Language, and they've had some other interesting poetry and things read. We did look into them, and one problem with the Scottish model is while they have a really good representation of different faiths out there, they're disproportionately dudes. They're disproportionately people who identify as male. And so this is an ongoing issue when it comes to prayer, and I'll talk a bit more about that a little later on. Yeah, good question. The answer is they're all Christian. We haven't noticed a lot of non-Christian prayers being delivered in municipalities. We can look back in the past, and that might be part of our ongoing research. Good question. Yeah, so that kind of, basically we're going to be looking at all 3,700 municipalities across the country. And we did a quick survey of 19 municipalities in Alberta, and we found one of them was currently violating the Constitution. That was Wetaskiwin. So they had their inaugural meeting start with a prayer. And we reckon if we look at municipalities across the country, we'll be able to identify a percentage of municipalities that are violating the law. And then we can send them letters and remind them that they should be following it. Any other questions before we move on to our the next item? So once we looked at municipal councils, we then looked at the provincial legislature. So daily sessions of the BC legislature prior to November 2019 began with prayers. And as Adam was asking with the question, they weren't Hansardized, which means they weren't transcribed into the record, nor do we know who was delivering that prayer. So if you're interested in a larger study of this, I'm going to actually post the link in the chat box because I gave about an hour and a half long talk on this subject, and I don't want to go into the report in too much detail. But for those who are interested, this is the podcast with the full breakdown of the report that we wrote. Basically, we sent this out more than 2 years ago, where the BC Humanists were interested in looking at the religiosity and content of the prayers delivered in the BC legislature. And we went about, and this was a huge process because they weren't Hansardized. So we couldn't just download the prayers. We actually had to transcribe them all. So we recruited 52 volunteers who transcribed 877 prayers. We also did 70 of those twice just to make sure that we were getting accuracy correct. And our volunteers had an excellent accuracy rate. And we broke down all the content of those prayers in the House of Prayers report. And Katie ran a lot of the analysis and the coding for that. Renil here was one of our amazing researchers who helped code all of those prayers. And if you're interested in that content, we have a 138-page report that's on the website and linked in the chat. Do please check it out. But the summary of that study was that the prayers in the BC legislature are disproportionately religious. Fewer MLAs are delivering prayers. The prayers are getting longer. They're getting more religious. And they ultimately don't represent the views of British Columbians. And so I won't go into too much detail rehashing those findings, but basically we found that 71.2% of the prayers were religious, and where we were able to identify the religion, 93.1% of those were Christian. And so that's a lot of one religion being represented in a very diverse province. So I'll pause there, but I would encourage people to check out the report or to at least read the summary of it, because it does really break down the results and the content of the prayers that we found in the BC legislature. So we've kind of moved on from that project and we've expanded in a number of ways. So one of them is the municipal council studies, but the other ones are a couple of other updates we've done. So we were really kind of excited, kind of not excited, but in November 2019, the BC legislature changed their standing orders. So Standing Order 25 is the one that says that daily sittings start with a prayer, and they updated that from prayer to prayer and reflection, prayers and reflections. So that is kind of a change. And so we were it seemed somewhat promising that they made a bit of an adaptation. So now that we can have prayers and reflections. One of the problems with only calling them prayers is that even if someone wants to deliver a secular invocation, that person is still tempted to still fit within the confines of a prayer. So we actually noticed this, that a significant percentage of the prayers that were coded as secular still ended in amen. So 88.7% of the prayers that we considered secular still ended in amen. And that's mostly because of the structure. If someone asks you to deliver a prayer, even if you don't want to deliver an actual prayer, you're still often going to adhere to the hegemonic structures of prayer and the culture that you're in. And we actually submitted 6 sample prayers ourselves, and we had a lot of difficulty writing them in such a way that they wouldn't seem overtly prayer-like. So that was kind of an interesting change that happened in the BC legislature. So one of the studies that we're going to do, and this is a book chapter that we're going to be having coming out most likely next year, depending on academic publishing cycles, which again remains unknown. I have a book chapter that's been waiting for 2 years to come out. But we're going to look at how the content of prayers has changed since the update. So up until November 2019, we have prayers, and then from then to the current, we have prayers and reflections. And so it's not necessarily the most robust sample size. It's probably only about 60 or 70 prayers at best. So but we're going to look and see how those have changed over time. Another thing that changed specifically was that Leonard Krogh left the BC legislature and has become mayor of Nanaimo. And that's significant only because he delivered more prayers than any other MLA in the study sample. In the report, we have league tables that list who's delivered the most prayers, and it's Leonard Krogh at the top of every single table. And his prayers were of a certain variety. And so ultimately, it's going to totally change the face of prayer in the BC legislature, because from 2003 on, we basically have one guy, who I think it was at one point 23% of the NDP prayers or some other significant percentage were one dude. So that's going to be one of our update studies. And a second study that's coming out that Ian and I are working on is the history of prayer in the BC legislature. So this recent change in November kind of turned us on to the fact that prayer has evolved over time in BC legislature. So yeah, basically prayer has evolved over time. It's hard to study though, because as we mentioned before, prayer is not included in Hansard. So you don't have a written record. So you'll often just have a line that says prayer. We don't know what's being said there. So we're currently going through the legislative records to find out when prayer changed from the Lord's Prayer to MLA's choice to the current model. And just as a quick point of interest, the current model is that MLAs are invited to deliver a prayer. They're given a sample sheet with 5 sample prayers on it. They may deliver one of those prayers, or they can deliver a prayer of their own devising. And 50% of MLAs choose to deliver the prayer from the sample sheet. And this is directly relevant to our next project, which I'm going to transition into now, but I will pause for additional questions. And yeah, so we are looking at the history of prayer in BC. Was that a hand, Beth, or I don't know? Oh, really good question from Adam. So the sample sheet. So let's get into that right away. So basically, there is a sample sheet of prayers. As I mentioned, there's 5 prayers on it, and they are given to MLAs. And MLAs tend to use those prayers 50% of the time. Sometimes they'll mix them together. So they'll pick a few prayers from one and a few prayers from they'll combine 2 of them. Or they'll read the first line of one and the second line of another, almost like they don't know how to follow along with reading. Of those 5 prayers, we coded 2 of them as secular, and that they sort of just say, hey, let's all hope that BC is prosperous. We coded 3 of them as overtly religious. So if you're interested in these, if you go to I'll give you the link here again. If you click on this link here, this is the report, and you can just And if you click on that, you can just search, one of the appendixes is the list of sample prayers, and you can read them. One thing that's noteworthy is that the two prayers that we coded as secular still ended in Amen. So you're still getting that prayer structure that's very much sort of from the Abrahamic traditions, and it's not a traditional way of ending a prayer for other cultural groups. So it's still very much within one group of one religious group or one broader ecosystem of religious traditions. Now, here's the fun stuff. This is the ongoing research. And
quickly, one of the things that I wanted to mention that came out of the analysis that I personally found really fascinating was that there was strong evidence that MLAs from different parties tend to use prayers very differently.
Right. Oh, I have that here. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that. Really good. This is just so much information that we get on this. Oh, yeah, it was 11 point something percent. Oh, here it is. Yeah, if you look at the different parties, they're more likely to do like religious versus non-religious. So NDP MLAs were more likely to give secular prayers, 31.4% versus 26%. And liberal MLAs were significantly more likely to deliver Christian prayers, with 25.4% identified as Christian compared with 9.2% of the prayers by NDP MLAs. One thing that's also worth mentioning is that we had very conservative coding when it came to determining what was Christian and what was not. So unless the prayer overtly mentioned a Jesus character or had language that was explicitly from the religious text of Christianity, we wouldn't code it as Christian. So just because a prayer started with Heavenly Father, we wouldn't code that as Christian, because it could also be a Mormon prayer. It could be a prayer from another religious tradition. So when we say that, say, 23% of the prayers in the BC legislature, or let me get the exact number for you here, 20.2% of the prayers delivered in the BC legislature were identified as explicitly Christian, that doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of the other prayers didn't also fit into that prayer ecosystem. Yeah, and there's so many different fascinating things we can look at. So for example, when we do our update study on BC legislative prayer, we're going to look at things like gender. We didn't look at that in the last study because we just had so much content. But the question would be like, are people identifying as female delivering prayers more likely to be religious or not, to deliver religious prayers or not? There's so much stuff that you can do. And the cool thing is, and because we believe in open access, all of our data is publicly available. Katie has made her coding available. It's in the report. If you follow the link to the report itself, you can look at our database, and you can use the database, and you can do whatever math and any analysis that you want on it. And we encourage you to do so, because there's a lot of things that can be found within that those prayers as well. I mean, we didn't even look at like the words themselves and closeness of words and proximity of different terms. And there was just so much stuff we could have done. Yeah, great point. Thank you. Yeah, so there is a list of sample prayers. And here's the interesting thing. So the clerk of the BC legislature contacted us last year about the fact that they were revising the current practices around prayer. And that's why we released the House of Prayers report, because we were already working on the project for about a year and a half, but we kind of scrambled to get the thing together to make the deadline so that the report itself could influence the process involved in reviewing prayer. The clerk got in touch with us again and said that they're making a list of prayers, a sample list of prayers, and could we help contribute some humanist prayers or invocations or declarations. It's always difficult to talk about these things. They're prayer, we call them prayers, but some of them are poems. Some of them are actually, we found some great like partisan attacks, some threats that were delivered through the prayers. Like one of the MLAs threatened a union through his prayer, which was very controversial. And, you know, we've had, Renil had compiled a great list of some of the most ridiculous prayers we found. Some of them thanked, God for shipping contracts. There was definitely a few veiled partisan swipes across the aisle, as it were. So we compiled a list of 6 sample invocations that could be included in this list, and those can be found in the House of Prayers study. But then we got to thinking, okay, this is problematic. You've asked the BC Humanists to submit prayers to reflect 67% of British Columbians that don't believe in a God. We're not representative of that group, right? Just because someone on the BC Census says that they're not religious doesn't mean that they would be a member of the PCHA, and they probably aren't given our membership numbers, which are going up, but they aren't 60% of the province. So that was a bit of a problem. But the next report we're working on is called Arbiters of Faith, and it explores whether the clerk of the BC legislature can actually look into the question of what is prayer, what is religion, and we basically come to the conclusion that no, the clerk of the BC legislature can't actually decide what prayers to include on the sample list without breaking the Constitution. So, for example, I'll walk you through some of the questions that we explore in this report, and it's coming out. This is actually an academic article, so it's going to peer review in a couple of days. The first question is like, what constitutes a religion? So under Canadian jurisprudence, it's not clear. We don't know what an actual religion is. right? So whether some people say, well, I know it when I see it. So yeah, clearly, Roman Catholicism is a religion, but is Eckankar a religion? Is Scientology a religion? Is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Noodle Monster a religion? And it's really difficult for getting shout outs to our Pastafarian friends. It's really difficult to decide what is a religion. And this becomes a problem when the clerk of the BC legislature is asking different religions to submit sample prayers. Do they ask the unions for a prayer to the workers? Do they ask Eckankarists for someone to come chant the Hugh before a meeting? And do they ask Pastafarians to come and drink, I suppose, a toast, maybe chug a beer before the meeting starts? I think that's a culturally appropriate. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, people are raising glasses in the chat. There we go. I think that's a culturally appropriate Pastafarian reference. So if you look on our report, breaks down the jurisprudence on this. We don't know what actually is a religion. And as a result, the clerk can't really canvass religions for sample prayers because we don't know what they are. But even once we've done that, there's another problem, and that is what religions make the cut. Just because something is a religion doesn't mean it's very well represented in British Columbia. So 0.5% of British Columbians identified themselves as being Jewish in the last census. Now there was about 2-point-something% of prayers in the BC legislature were prayers that we classified as Jewish, but there were no Sikh prayers. But a significantly larger percentage of people identify as Sikh in British Columbia. And so when we look at how do you actually decide which religions to ask, the first method is bureaucratic familiarity. So some religions are just better represented, and so the bureaucrats just sort of pick the ones they know. That doesn't really work though, because they just may not know about all the different religions. Again, people who follow the teachings of Sri Harold Klemp and are Eckankarists will have no idea, are definitely not going to be understood and fall into the bureaucratic familiarity of the clerk of the BC legislature. I'd be surprised if most of you know what Eckankar is. Go have some fun. There's a deep dive you can take on Ono, Ross, and Carey, a great podcast, and they break it down into lots of detail, which is why I think I have probably too much familiarity with it. But the next thing you could do is population
really quick, Lauren has a question about the Scottish model.
The Scottish model. Yeah, so this is the question, could you use the Scottish model here? The challenge with the Scottish model, again, now that kind of it flows perfectly into my next point, which is population demographics. You could do exactly what they're doing in Scotland. There are some problems with this as well, though, simply because you have, I think it's 32,000 different sects, different denominations of Protestant, right? And so the question would be then, okay, which ones do we pick? And then the other questions would be, okay, which ones are we asking to be representative of a different group? And I'll talk about this in a moment, but there's a lot of other problems with asking organized religious groups and non-organized religious groups. The other challenge you get, actually, I'll talk about that now because it came up. As I mentioned with the Scottish model, you get disproportionately men participating because they're overrepresented in the clergy of most religions because there's a lot of sexism. And so that's a huge problem that's magnified in this process. But again, there's that other question of who speaks for the non-believers. So if you look at the demographics of British Columbians, and I'll bring up my chart here because it's helpful.
And I was going to say, Adam just mentioned representation of groups that do not do prayer. So some religious groups that don't, yeah.
Well, it goes, actually, just to build on that, what Adam was adding, some groups don't do public prayer, right? There's actually a strong Christian tradition that says, don't be like the I think it's Matthew. Oh, I'm going to get my Bible verse wrong here. But, don't be like the hypocrite and don't pray in public. Jehovah's Witnesses won't engage in civic activity of this nature. There's some religions that wouldn't permit prayer in this setting. So, for example, you have to deliver a prayer in a consecrated building. Don't think the legislature is consecrated. Some religious traditions prohibit the delivery of prayer in front of non-believers or in front of women. And those groups then couldn't be represented in the legislature. So there's a lot of groups that would necessarily be excluded by nature of their beliefs. And again, it becomes an even deeper question of, how do we pick these groups? And particularly for non-believers. Just because someone is a non-believer doesn't mean they don't necessarily have a spiritual tradition or a faith tradition. And there's even more problems. And this is just building up. Thank you, Matthew 6:5. Thank you, Renil. There's another big problem. And that's which demographic data do you rely on? If you rely on the census asks people a question in a certain way. And I don't have the wording in front of me here. But basically, the way that it's worded, it's asking them sort of to follow, which religious tradition do you belong to? But that doesn't necessarily reflect whether they believe in that tradition itself. So you can have someone who's, say, for example, identifies as a secular Jew who would be uncomfortable with a religious prayer being delivered on their behalf, still check the Jewish box on the census. So and our demographic data is not very good because the long-form census was I can still blame Harper for getting rid of that and destroying tons of wealth of data. So that was a bit of an issue as well. So you can try the Scottish model. It's definitely better than other models, but it does still have its problems. And I've only gone into some of them. More of them are in the paper. There's been some other comments here. Let me just check those out there. Why should it be excluded in general? Let me get into that in a sec.
I think he was just mentioning, that there are all of these different problems, and he's just commenting that's why prayer should be excluded as a general rule.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, so basically the finding of this study is that either we let MLAs do it themselves or we abolish it. The BCHA is very firm that we abolish legislative prayer because it's just incredibly problematic. But this is sort of another shot at the process. And it kind of also, the paper that we're releasing is looking at, okay, well, other legislatures that want to review legislative prayer, can they actually do this? Is it possible to review it? And if the revision process is more difficult than just abolishing it, then ideally we just abolish it, right? If it's impossible to review the process, then clearly the process is broken, is unconstitutional, and the revision process is unconstitutional. And that's kind of where we're building to. Yeah, sorry, Lauren, that makes much more sense. Yeah, so when you use census data, it's very complicated. The third option would be to use the demographics of the legislature. After all, the prayer is supposed to be for the legislators. It's not supposed to be public. The problem there, of course, becomes like privacy issues. People's religions change over time. And again, like, this doesn't seem like the appropriate place for it, right? If people want to pray before they go into the legislature, they can meet up in a meeting room or pray on their own time. They shouldn't be doing it publicly. So there's a lot of other issues around that. So then the question becomes, what prayers do you use? Because just because you said we're going to have 1 Jewish prayer and 7 Protestant prayers and 3 Sikh prayers, now you have to pick those prayers. And it becomes even more problematic, not just from a constitutional perspective, but from a practical perspective. So, for example, you can say, oh, we're going to have 1 Jewish prayer, but now you're asking Reform Jews and Hasidic Jews to pick a prayer. There is no way that they're going to agree on a single prayer. You might have Anglicans and Catholics, some forms of Protestants, agreeing to the Lord's Prayer, but you're certainly not going to get agreement. So getting head shakes, you might, but you probably won't, right? Like Anglicans have numerous prayers they might pick, so that's a problem. And then there's another problem, which is, who do you ask? If you ask the bishop, now you're asking the representative of that faith. Well, some faith traditions don't have a clear hierarchical structure. So do you ask every single charismatic Christian house preacher what prayer they would use? Or do you ask every single different small segment of Hasidism which Jewish prayer they would submit? That becomes problematic. But it gets even deeper. As I mentioned before, the people you're asking are disproportionately men, and you're not asking their congregants which prayers they like. So the prayer that the local bishop might pick is not the prayer that the ladies' auxiliary would pick. And so you have a huge issue there, And it gets even further, like, as we mentioned before, how do you pick the non-religious folks? Do you do an open survey? So you could conceivably ask the public what they wanted. Well, here's one problem. First of all, the jurisprudence has established that the Canadian government cannot arbitrate between matters of dogma. So apart from like typography and spelling and like punctuation, if the clerk of the House of Legislature has 2 prayers, yeah, sorry, Lauren, I'm piling on here. It's a 35-page report. You can see it all. It piles on heavily. But if the speaker or the clerk of the House has 2 prayers and they're both like spelled properly, they have no basis for picking between the 2 of them without breaking the Constitution and picking one version of the religion over another. So even arbitrating between 2 different texts, and we're talking like it could be the difference between in his name or in Jesus' name, just picking the difference between those 2 prayers would violate the Constitution. So it becomes impossible for the clerk of the House to actually pick a prayer. So you could leave it up to the public, but there's no way to pick between them. And as a quick aside, when the government of Ontario discussed reviewing and replacing the Lord's Prayer with another prayer, their website actually shut down because they had too many responses from people expressing an opinion on it. So we could survey the entire public of British Columbia. We could have every single person submit a prayer, because ultimately people's religious beliefs are different. 2 people sitting in the pews of the same small church are not going to agree on everything. Or again, we could just abolish it, or get the MLAs to deliver it. So that's our study on arbiters of faith, and I'm really excited because that paper is going off to peer review in like the next week, and it kind of builds on this whole process of like, when are we able, how can the clerk possibly pick a prayer? And the answer is they can't. It's just not possible to do so without violating the Constitution. I'm going to pause there because there's a lot of good comments on there. Anyone want to have any questions or thoughts on that before I move on to sort of the last big summary here? Excellent. Yeah, and again, I think, Lauren, you raised a really good point, which is it's so complicated and so constitutionally problematic to pick a sample set of prayers and even to deliver prayer in the BC legislature, that the practice should be ended. But the question is, what do we replace it with? So I'll segue into the next research project here nicely. Across Canada, there's different practices. So some legislatures start with the Lord's Prayer or a slight version of the Lord's Prayer. Some of them will start with the Speaker of the House delivering a prayer of their own choosing, of their own devising. Some of them will have nothing. So Newfoundland and Labrador starts with no prayer. And some of them will have a moment of silent reflection. So Quebec starts with a moment of silent reflection. The BCHA has a hierarchy of preferences. We would like to abolish it. If we must, replace it with a moment of quiet reflection. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't pray during that, but you could also prepare your speech or play Candy Crush. The third option, which we also were supportive of, was to replace it with a territorial land acknowledgement. This has become more common in an age of truth and reconciliation, but it's kind of astounding that the BC legislature does not start with an official territorial land acknowledgement. So our other report, which is coming out shortly as soon as we finish the design work on it, literally explores that question. So some background here. This again builds off the House of Prayers study. And we looked at the House of Prayers study and we found that only 6% of the prayers had content that could be classified as Indigenous content. And 85.7% of those 6% were a single word. And they're disproportionately a couple of MLAs from Northern British Columbia using one single word. Yes. Oh, no, Adam, I'm going to get to that. I'll come into that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, this is a really good question. His question was, isn't there a risk of reducing the impact of a land recognition if it becomes pro forma part of a daily activity? Absolutely. And I promise I'll get to that in a sec. So a bit more in the background, though. And this is actually just to preface what Katie is going to probably contribute here as well. We looked at the prayers. We found that New Democratic MLAs were much more likely to have First Nations content in their prayers, 11.7%, compared to Liberals, 0.2%. So there's definitely a partisan division there. So just a bit of overview of First Nations involvement or Indigenous involvement in the BC legislature. Prior to 1949, Indigenous people could not vote in the BC legislature or hold office there. And Inuit were not permitted to vote until 1950. And Ian found this amazing bit of information, actually more horrifying than amazing. But despite the fact that Inuit could technically vote, they were not supplied with ballot boxes until 1962. So that was a huge problem. And up until 1960, status Indians under the Indian Act could only vote in a federal election if they revoked their status. So there's a history of exclusion of Indigenous and First Nations people in legislatures and parliament. And once First Nations folks were permitted to vote, we saw a very marginal increase in their getting elected. The first person elected, the first Indigenous person was Frank Arthur Calder of the Nisga'a Nation. He was elected in 1949, and he held the seat until 1979. And he was the only Indigenous MLA until 2005. So there's a large gap, and there's still a really small number. We identified only 6 Indigenous persons ever elected to the BC legislature. So that's a bit of an issue as well. So not only do we have a lack of an acknowledgement that the legislature itself is built on unceded territory, but we also have a history of Indigenous people not being represented in that legislature. So this report that's coming out basically analyzes that and looks at some of the other aspects related to sort of colonialism and oppression within the BC legislature. And I'm going to bring up my other notes here. Basically, as I mentioned, we break them down. We don't see a lot of Indigenous content. So our recommendation was we should abolish legislative prayer. We could replace it with a territorial land acknowledgement, but we wanted to make sure that, and Adam raised a really good point, that this wasn't pro forma. And we also didn't think it was up to us to come up with a structure for this, right? If we're coming up with the way that we acknowledge Indigenous territory in the legislature, that should be done in consultation with Indigenous people, and those people should be developing the process that works for them. Now, we have a huge number of different diverse cultures across British Columbia, so that's going to be a complicated process. But obviously, part of truth and reconciliation involves engaging with that, right? Yeah, so basically the idea would be the BC legislature, if it wanted to really decolonize, there's a lot more work to be done, don't get me wrong. And this is very much sort of a small aspect to a broader conversation around decolonization. But the fact that we start with a prayer and that are disproportionately from one religious group over others and don't start with a territorial land acknowledgement is a bit of a problem. So that's our first recommendation. And the recommendation coming out of this report was, first of all, to let people know that Indigenous content is disproportionately underrepresented in prayer. And second of all, to ask that if we do create a territorial land acknowledgement, that it will be done in consultation with First Nations and be made appropriate. I mean, there's different models you could do, right? You can invite different representatives of different nations to deliver an acknowledgement. It's somewhat awkward only because the legislature is here in Victoria, but there's no reason why we couldn't invite someone from different nations across the province to deliver an invocation. I was looking at the legislative prayer practices in Nunavut and Northwest Territories, where they also ask MLAs to deliver a prayer. And several of their sessions will start with drumming, which makes sense, and it's culturally appropriate and is a way of welcoming people. So there's tons of different welcome processes we could do, and it would be a great opportunity to share different cultural practices, and they're currently not being done. So one of our hopes with this report is to encourage the BC legislature to at least consider starting with the territorial land acknowledgement. I will make one random note, which is that in addition to the most recent change whereby prayers became prayers and reflections, during the COVID, the ongoing COVID crisis, health issue, they've had much smaller sessions and meetings of the legislature. And as a result, they haven't always had the speaker present. And so we actually had a territorial acknowledgement made when Spencer Chandler Herbert filled in as deputy chair. I'm going to get the date on this one. This was just the other day, in fact, March 23rd. He started his session with a territorial acknowledgement, specifically referencing the Kwangwin peoples and their territories. So it's very much possible to do, and it can be included because the speaker can start the meeting however they'd like, but it's not codified in the standing orders or anything in that nature. There's been some questions, so I will stop prattling on here for a second just to catch up. Yeah, so Lauren raises a really interesting point, and this is that there is religious content often intermeshed with First Nations Indigenous content. This came up, for example, here in Saanich at the municipal prayer level. There was three declarations or invocations that started the most recent inaugural session. One was from a local pastor, another was from a local pastor, and the third was from a local representative of a local First Nations nation. And the First Nations invocation was very heavy in the language relating to Jesus. It was very religious, very Christian in nature. This does raise the question of like, if we're talking about not having religious content in the legislature, do we want to have religious content of very different cultures? It is very much possible to give a welcome address for various cultures without invoking the religious. This is an issue we haven't looked into as much, and it's one that will probably be a bit above my pay grade and experience insofar as like it's going to have to go to a court at some point. But there is a really interesting question around if we do have territorial land acknowledgements, if they're overtly religious in nature, would that also be a violation of the Constitution? And that's definitely something that people should be considering, and it's worth exploring further. Yeah, really good point. Other questions here. Yeah, and that's and Adam raised the other point, which is exactly right. Which is, and I've had this conversation with other people. You can't ask someone to welcome you onto their territory as a form of decolonization, and then ask them to explicitly say something on your behalf, because that becomes sort of colonizing their content itself. Again, that's why this becomes a bit of a minefield as far as navigating it correctly, and that's why I said it's kind of a bit outside my area of expertise. But it's definitely something that we should explore. It's also possible for an acknowledgement to be made in such a way that isn't religious in nature. But again, yeah, maybe asking someone not to deliver a religious one might be problematic. That's a really interesting question, which we should definitely be exploring in an age of truth and reconciliation. But I do not have an answer to that question. I don't think anyone does. And if you do, please let me know. You're happy to write an addendum to our report. Yeah. And there's some great conversation going on in the chat. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, and so that raises some like really good questions around like that does also invoke questions of, okay, you can have secular religious prayers. For example, there's also secular Jewish holidays, for example, and so you get lots of questions around like what constitutes a religion. Again, that's why when we talked about the previous report on arbiters of faith, the question becomes, what constitutes a religion becomes a very live question. What is interesting though is that there was a recent court decision made. Yeah, so this is this actually came out last year. It's in Port Alberni, their school district. Basically, the question was, can you have a smudging ceremony at a school as a demonstration for students of a cultural practice? And this went to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and it was decided that this was seen as acceptable in the school, so it was okay for students to observe a religious practice or a practice, but the court actually didn't adjudicate as to whether the Indigenous practice be considered religious. So we don't actually have an answer to that question. And it goes even deeper. If you look at the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency's definitions of a religion, and some court decisions around what is a religion, arguably Buddhism doesn't count as a religion under many laws. There was actually a decision that just came out. The Church of Atheism lost a Supreme Court case where the judge was like, yeah, you guys aren't a church. And it's worth reading that decision. Actually, it's quite interesting. Also, don't defend yourself in court. Seriously, get a real lawyer. But the main takeaway there was the judge said, you don't meet the criteria as a religion, but also conceded that under the current rough, vague definitions of what constitutes a religion, neither does Buddhism and many other traditions. So the definitions of religion themselves are often structured in such a way as they fit a Christian hegemony, and that becomes hugely problematic. I've been delving into the literature in the United States, where you have a hippie commune. And the hippie commune says, look, our farm should be exempt because we are communing with nature in doing our farming practices. And it's not recognized as a religion because it doesn't fit the parameters of what is considered a religion, which people are basically holding up Christianity as their baseline and comparing everything else to it. But that just seems hugely problematic. And then again, where does one draw the line between a religion and a spiritual practice, or a religion and a really strong belief? Here's another one I'll get you guys on, which I haven't done a report on, but I love wearing hats. I have a really strong preference for wearing hats. Someone who's religious has a really strong preference for wearing hats because of their religion. I like wearing hats for completely different reasons. I just like them. Does the fact that I don't have a religious basis for my hat preference mean that I shouldn't be allowed to wear a hat in the legislature, whereas someone who has a religious basis for their hat should be allowed to? That privileges religious views over non-religious views. And that becomes hugely problematic because then you're treating people differently based on their religion. Again, I really like hats. Like, I have a huge collection. I have 2 identical gray hats like this in case I lose one. But yeah, it becomes like, if you really believe something really hard because of fashion, or you really believe something really hard because of God, why would we privilege the belief in God more than others? It becomes really complicated. But ultimately, the answer to that question is you shouldn't. You shouldn't get more privilege because you happen to believe in a supernatural being compared to just really like a trilby. I'm going to catch up on some of the comment that's going on here. Yeah, there's been some questions about culture and religion. It gets really messy. It definitely is. And that, again, that's one of those questions of like some countries don't have protections for religious freedom, and we'll just include that in the freedom of consciousness, right? Like, why do we have a separate category for the Canadian Charter that says you have a right to freedom of consciousness and freedom of religion? They're the same thing. So it seems really problematic unless we are ascribing or smuggling in collective group rights into individual rights. And there's some deeper legal questions that are involved there. And those privileges come out in a lot of other things. And we see those coming out in things like permissive tax exemptions and other religious exemptions, which tend to privilege religious views over non-religious views, even if those views are comparable. I'm going to leave it at that. That basically got through all of our research. As I mentioned, we've got a couple other projects we're looking at. Tax exemptions is one of them at the municipal level, tax exemptions at the federal level, and other religious exemptions, which kind of, I guess, links really well to the hat conversation. But there's a lot of other ones that exist. And our researchers, Renil and Noah, went through all of the Canadian existing laws and found out all the different religious exemptions, and they vary considerably. So that's another aspect that we're going to be considering. So I'll leave it open to other questions here, last minute questions. That was a lot of information. I really appreciate you guys sticking out for all of that. As you can see, in summary, the BC Humanist Association is doing a lot of research. We're getting a lot of content out there, and we're having an impact, right? We have already seen that legislative practice has changed, which I was quite excited about. And we're hoping to have broader impact on actual tangible legislation in the near future and across the country as well.
Thanks, Beth. Appreciate that. I'm looking forward to seeing it come out as well. It's sort of nice when we publish these things that they can become part of the sort of academic literature and something that other groups can look at, can access, and it's not just something that sort of just gets posted on our website and potentially disappears, but it becomes part of the discussion around these issues. Adam's got a question about volunteer involvement.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yes. Oh, brilliant. Okay. I have something in this. One second. I'm just posting a link here. Hold on. The link I'm about to post is just the link to our Arbiters of Faith study. That's the one that I talked about with the speaker and the clerk, and whether they're able to adjudicate that. The whole report's coming out soon. So Adam's question is, how can you volunteer? Yes. So when we transcribed the prayers last year, our team, 52 people, did 877 prayers in like 2 months. It was amazing. Some people did like 300 or 400. I think the record was 250 prayers or some obscene amount. And it gets quite tedious because, as we said, 50% of the prayers are the sample prayers. So that was a bit of an issue. So we had our volunteers do that. We are going to be looking for volunteers this summer to transcribe the remaining prayers. So our study ended at 2019 in February. So we have about 2 years or 2.5 years of prayers that will need to be transcribed. So that we'll be looking for volunteers for. And then we'll likely be looking for volunteers to help with the municipal study moving forward. As I mentioned, there's 3,700 municipalities in Canada. We've looked at 174 of them. And it takes, for each municipality, you have to find their website. Sometimes, that involves putting on your 1990s goggles and looking at some terrible websites that were designed on like MySpace. Navigating their website, finding out if they had prayer or not, emailing them if you can't find the answer. So there are, thousands of municipalities that we can conceivably contact on that. And we'll possibly be looking for volunteers to help with that in the future. And also the other one would be if you have any ideas for additional research, we have the BCHA research whiteboard where we're compiling lists of other issues that arise. So in the future, moving forward, we're going to be looking at a couple other issues with some partners. One of them is looking at, too much information in my brain today. The other one would be looking at crisis pregnancy centers, which are often disproportionately religious and take advantage of people in vulnerable situations to discourage them from having abortions or to give them incorrect or
I was going to say that's what really gets me is the lying that they've been known to do. So
just as a quick bit of background on this, crisis pregnancy centers will often deceive people into thinking they're getting comprehensive information. So they'll say, here are the options available to you, and they will either downplay abortion as an option or provide incorrect and fear-based information. They'll dress up as doctors and nurses when they aren't actually. In the States, there's been some reports where they'll have similar logos to actual abortion clinics, and they'll set up around the corner so people might get lost and wander into their clinic. It's devious. So we're going to be partnering with the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada to do an investigation into that. And we have a list of other issues. So if you have an issue that comes up, please get in touch with us, let us know. And also, if you have some time on your hands because you're stuck at home with COVID, I'll talk to Ian about this, the potential of having people help with the municipal research, because there's thousands of municipalities we can look at. And it's kind of fun. You get to see the different practices in different municipalities and just how bad their websites are.
I was going to say, do we have any municipality by municipality information on the religiosity of those municipalities?
Oh, as far as their demographics or the councils or the prayers?
Of the demographics.
We don't. We could overlay it. It wouldn't be hard to overlay census data with the actual results of the prayers. I haven't thought to do that, actually. I'll make a note of that. Yeah.
I just think that'd be kind of interesting to see if more religious, municipalities tend to have more prayers.
I'm just looking at the list, right? I mean, obviously, some places we have the list is 100 Mile House. You got Langley, both Langley City and Township, North Vancouver, Peachland, Saanich Trail, Victoria Terrace, Williams Lake. So it's a pretty wide mix. But it would be interesting to compare the two of them and see whether there's an overlap. That's a good point. Well, let's talk about that offline, Katie, because I'd love to.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I'm always ooh, new analysis. I get all excited.
So much analysis. I love it. Yeah.
And thank you, Adam. Really appreciate that. It's really great to have the support of the members and just people saying, hey, this is great, because sometimes when you're sitting there with lines of code, it gets a little so.
Oh, I should also say one more thing, just to build on what Katie was mentioning there. We're almost all volunteers, right? So Ian is our director. We had the 2 summer students were paid for by the Canadian Summer Grants Program. I'm mostly a volunteer. I very occasionally get a small bursary or some small compensation, but most of our projects are volunteer basis. I think we only have funding for our permissive tax exemption study. So of all the studies I've mentioned, only one of them is a donor has given us money for. The rest of them are all voluntary. So if you can't help out directly by getting involved in the projects or telling people about them or engaging some of our letter writing campaigns that work in conjunction with these things, you can also, and I shamelessly plug, you can also support the campaigns by sponsoring a project because it does help us get them done quicker in many ways. Yeah. And the other thing is letters too. So for example, the House of Prayers project was accompanied by a huge province-wide letter writing campaign where we had hundreds of letters go in to MLAs about the subject, and there'll be more in the future on that. The other one is, and I should mention this, if you look at our municipal reports and you find that you happen to live in a municipality which is either giving away tens of thousands or even millions of dollars to a place of worship, and you don't think that's right. Or conversely, if your municipality has prayer at the beginning of their municipal sessions, their inaugural sessions, please let us know, because we're always looking for people who have standing in those communities. Because as I mentioned, moving forward with the municipal prayer particularly, if this municipality, the 23 municipalities, continue to start their inaugural sessions of prayer, that would be a court case waiting to happen. And we'd love for people who have standing in those communities to step up and to make that be our complainant, as it were.
All right, Teale, is that it, do you think?
I think it might be it. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, by the way, you can get in touch with me. I will also just very briefly mention that I do a bunch of other research. So I'm the research director for a marine conservation group, Oceans Asia. I do independent research. I do a bunch of other work on local noise pollution. Also, I work with using placemaking work here and research around that in Saanich and Victoria. So if you want to learn more about my various research, you can also go to my website, teale.ca, and also just get in touch. You can get in touch through that. I'm happy to talk about our work or share some of our reports with you if you can't find them. And and get in touch with the BCHA if you want to get involved. We're always looking for volunteers to work on our various projects.
And I was going to say, if you have any feedback about how this session worked, this was a bit of a, first trial run, please either let Teale or Ian know. You can find his email address on the BC Humanists website. And in general, we're just kind of looking for things that were useful, not so useful. And this video will eventually make its way onto the BC Humanist website. So thank you very much for participating, being so active and engaged in this. It's really, it really just makes everything that we do so much better when we have lots of people involved. So thank you.
With that, I'm just going to figure out how to turn this off here. I guess wish you all a wonderful lockdown and keep yourself entertained. And definitely the feedback's helpful because we haven't done this before, but we'd love to do more of them. I love talking about our work, and very few people get to see our research apart from the clerk who gets all of it.
Sure. Have a wonderful Friday, everybody.